The $500 violation notice was still folded in my saddlebag when Caroline Voss told me to get copper off the trail. I looked down at my horse's hooves, then at the fence line running through 26 acres my family owned outside Franklin, Tennessee. She was the HOA president, yet somehow her board was fining me for riding on my own land. What Caroline did not understand was that Briar Glen depended on that same strip of property every single day. If somebody tried regulating your land while benefiting from it, what would you do? To understand why I eventually stopped arguing, we need to go back to the morning Caroline first pointed at the ground beneath Copper. I had Copper walking easy along the West Loop when I saw Caroline Voss standing beside a new white trail marker near my fence. She raised one hand, and I brought him to a stop before she had to step closer. "Ethan, horses cannot be on this section anymore," she said. I glanced past her toward Briar Glen, then down at the gravel beneath Copper. "You mean the subdivision trail?" "I mean this trail." Caroline pointed directly between Coppa's front hooves. I leaned forward in the saddle and followed the fence line with my eyes. The drainage swale was on my left. An old survey pin sat 12 feet beyond it. Nothing about the boundary had changed. "Caroline, you are standing on the Mercer parcel." She stayed calm. "Residents have complained about horses mixing with pedestrians. The board adopted a pedestrian-only safety policy. Your board can adopt whatever rules it wants inside Briar Glen. My acreage is not in Briar Glen." She took out her phone and photographed the trail marker, Copper, and the fence. "That bothered me more than an argument would have. I am documenting the location," she said. "Then document the survey pin too." I pointed toward it. She looked, but she did not take that picture. 48 hours later, an envelope from Briar Glen Homeowners Association arrived in my mailbox. I opened it at the barn workbench with Copper chewing hay 10 feet away. The notice assessed $500 for unauthorized equestrian activity on a community recreational corridor. I read it twice. Then I noticed something worse. They had printed my actual county parcel number beneath my name. This was not a letter accidentally sent to the wrong Ethan Mercer. Someone had identified my land and fined me anyway. I photographed every page, scanned the envelope, and rode the loop on foot instead of horseback so I could inspect the entire route without creating another alleged violation. Fresh pedestrian-only markers had appeared along nearly half a mile of my property. I did not touch them. I photographed each one beside fixed landmarks, measured their distance from the fence, and saved the locations on my phone. The last marker stood beside an old cedar post near the northern turn. I remembered my father replacing that post when I was young, but I had never paid attention to the dark marks beneath the weathered paint. I rubbed the surface with my thumb. A burned letter appeared. Then another. I scraped away a little more dirt with the edge of my glove until one faded word emerged across the wood. "Permission." I stared at it, then back toward the neighborhood trail, because suddenly the question was not why Briar Glen thought it could regulate my land. The question was what my father had once given them permission to do on it. I called Caroline before noon and asked her to meet me at the cedar post. She arrived 20 minutes later carrying a leather portfolio instead of another violation notice. I showed her the burned word, then walked her north along the fence until we reached the opening where Briar Glen residents entered my acreage. "I am not closing anything," I said. "I want to know what arrangement my father made." Caroline studied me for a moment. "That is exactly why the board needs consistency. People have used this connection for almost 20 years. A retired couple passed us while we talked. Caroline waited until they were out of earshot. Families walk through here to reach the park entrance. Children use it after school. Home listings describe access to this loop. This is not some forgotten shortcut. Usage does not tell me who controls it. Neither does a burned word on a post." She had a point, and I hated that she had one. My father had been generous with neighbors. If he had granted Briar Glen some formal access right, I needed to know before treating the trail as exclusively mine to control. Caroline opened her portfolio and handed me a one-page proposal. "Sign an acknowledgement that this corridor follows Briar Glen Trail safety rules, and I will recommend reducing the assessment to $250. I looked at her. "You are offering to cut a fine for something I still say you have no authority to fine. I am offering a practical solution." I handed the page back and signed. "Then show me the document giving your board authority here." That evening I went through the wooden file cabinet my father had kept behind the tack room. Most folders held feed receipts, equipment warranties, and old veterinary bills. Near the bottom, I found a folded trail map drawn over a survey copy of the northern acreage. The route matched the path Briar Glen residents still used, including both neighborhood entrances. Across the top, in my father's handwriting, were 3 words: Mercer Courtesy Loop. That sounded reassuring until I turned the page over. In the margin he had written, annual permission renewed after maintenance payment. I sat down on an overturned bucket and read the sentence again. Caroline had been wrong to call the trail an HOA corridor, but I had been wrong to assume the neighborhood had no documented arrangement at all. Somewhere there had to be payments, renewal terms, or an agreement explaining what annual permission actually meant. Then my phone buzzed. An email from Briar Glen had arrived with the subject line Final Assessment Notice. The $500 charge was no longer being offered for reduction. The board had confirmed it in full, and the notice gave me 30 days to dispute it through the association's formal process. I looked from the email to my father's handwritten map, because now I had 2 documents describing the same strip of ground in completely different ways. I stopped treating the trail like a boundary dispute and started treating it like an accounting problem. My father had recorded every unusual payment that came into the farm, so I pulled his old ledgers and worked backward through the years. Briar Glen appeared again and again. $800, $900, then $1,200. Each payment carried some variation of the same notation: trail maintenance. That changed the question. If Briar Glen believed it controlled the corridor, why had it been paying my family to maintain ground it claimed as a community amenity? One name appeared repeatedly beside the older checks: Linda Carver, former Briar Glen treasurer. I called her. Linda remembered my father immediately. "Your dad was particular about that trail," she said. "He wanted people to enjoy it, but he never wanted anyone confusing kindness with ownership." I asked whether Briar Glen had an easement. She paused. "Not when I was treasurer. We had a license." The word landed harder than I expected. Linda explained that the association made annual maintenance payments under a renewable access arrangement. Residents could walk the designated route, but the Mercer family retained ownership and agricultural use. I asked if she still had a copy. She did not. "The association should," she said. "We referenced it every year." I called Caroline immediately. Her response was controlled. "Historical arrangements do not necessarily determine current rights." "Then send me whatever replaced the license. I will have counsel review the records." She ended the call politely, which told me she was taking this more seriously than before. The next morning, Caroline emailed me a page from Briar Glen's current homeowner disclosure package. Under recreational amenities, it listed walking access to the northern loop. That was not proof of ownership, but it created a different problem. People had bought homes after being told the trail was part of what the neighborhood offered. Caroline called 10 minutes later. "You see why I cannot simply tell hundreds of homeowners the trail belongs entirely to you. Whether they were told something does not change my deed." "No, but reliance matters, Ethan. So does 20 years of continuous use." For the first time, I understood what she was protecting. If the HOA had been advertising my father's permission as a permanent amenity, admitting the mistake could create consequences far beyond my $500 fine. Before hanging up, I asked one question. "Caroline, when did you first learn there was a Mercer license?" Silence held for 2 seconds. Then she said, "I need to speak with counsel before answering that." That evening, another document arrived in my email from Briar Glen's records request portal. It was a maintenance authorization from 18 months earlier, signed electronically by Caroline Voss herself. The description read, "Annual payment, Mercer Courtesy Access License." Caroline had known exactly what the trail was before she ever fined me for riding on it. I did not confront Caroline with the authorization. Instead, I sent it to Daniel Price, a Franklin property attorney I had used once for a boundary adjustment, along with my deed, the violation notice, my father's map, and photographs of the new signs. Daniel called the next afternoon. "Stop arguing about whether you are allowed to ride there," he said. "That assumes the HOA has authority you need to defeat. Make them establish that authority first." It was the first advice that changed how I saw the problem. Through Daniel, I disputed the assessment and requested the declaration, covenant, easement, license, or other recorded instrument Briar Glen claimed allowed it to regulate my 26 acres. Caroline responded by asking me to meet privately at the association office. She was different when I arrived. No lecture. No threats. She placed a proposed agreement between us. Briar Glen would cancel the $500 fine. I would retain title. Residents would receive permanent pedestrian access, while horses would be excluded from the narrow trail section during morning and evening walking hours. For about 30 seconds, I considered it. I did not want retirees losing their morning walk because Caroline and I could not settle a paperwork dispute. I want people to keep using the trail, I told her. If we can protect my rights and make it safe, I am willing to work something out. I left without signing. 2 nights later, I attended the board meeting. Caroline repeated my statement. Publicly, but differently. Mr. Mercer has acknowledged that continued community access carries reasonable community obligations. I felt my jaw tighten. That is not what I said. Several homeowners turned toward me. Caroline remained composed. You agreed the trail should remain available. I said I was willing to negotiate. I did not give your board jurisdiction over my farm. That meeting ended any chance I would rely on verbal understandings again. Daniel and I examined the historical license language Linda had described, using an archived copy Briar Glen finally produced through my records request. One paragraph changed everything. The Mercer family expressly retained agricultural and equestrian use. Another provided that interference by the association with those retained uses could constitute grounds for termination after written notice and an opportunity to cure. I read the clause 3 times. The HOA had not merely issued a questionable fine. By trying to prohibit copper from the trail, it may have triggered the very provision protecting my family's right to withdraw neighborhood access. Daniel warned me not to celebrate. Termination would affect people who had nothing to do with Caroline's decision, and Briar Glen could fight it. Then Caroline's formal settlement draft arrived. The fine would disappear completely, but in exchange I would grant Briar Glen a perpetual pedestrian easement and recognize its authority to impose reasonable trail regulations. I finally understood the choice in front of me. Pay nothing and surrender permanent control, or risk becoming the man who closed a neighborhood trail to protect land that had been mine all along. I told Daniel to reject the perpetual easement and send Caroline something narrower. A formal cure notice built around the agreement Briar Glen itself had finally produced. It identified the $500 assessment, the pedestrian-only signs, and the attempted restriction on my retained equestrian use. I gave the association the cure period required by the license instead of demanding immediate termination. Caroline responded faster than I expected. Within 4 days, every pedestrian-only marker disappeared from my property. Then Briar Glen placed the assessment on administrative hold. The following morning, I saddled Copper and rode the Mercer courtesy loop for the first time since the dispute escalated. Nobody stopped me. A woman walking her terrier stepped aside and smiled. 2 retirees waved like they always had. For half a mile, the trail felt normal again. That afternoon, Caroline emailed a proposed board acknowledgement. The opening language looked almost perfect. Briar Glen recognized that the Mercer parcel remained privately owned. The association acknowledged that Ethan Mercer retained title to the trail corridor. The $500 assessment would be permanently withdrawn. I actually leaned back in my chair thinking we had finished this. Then Daniel called. Read paragraph 6. I did. Once. Then again slowly. The document converted Briar Glen's existing access into a perpetual pedestrian easement and granted the association authority to establish reasonable safety regulations governing use of the corridor. The wording was cleaner than Caroline's previous proposal, but the result was the same. I would win the argument over $500 while giving Briar Glen something my father had deliberately never given it: permanent access combined with regulatory leverage. I called Caroline. Why is an easement inside an acknowledgement of my ownership? Because ownership and access are separate issues. Exactly. So withdraw the fine without changing the access agreement. Her voice stayed measured. Ethan, hundreds of residents have relied on that trail for years. I cannot leave their access dependent on one landowner changing his mind. My family did not change the arrangement. Your board tried to change it. She went quiet, then said something I could not dismiss. If you terminate access, those residents will not blame a contract written 20 years ago. They will blame you. After the call, I walked to the cedar post and watched 3 families cross onto my acreage. Caroline understood my weakness perfectly. She knew I did not want innocent neighbors paying for her decision. But I finally understood hers too. The fine had become Expendable. Permanent control was what mattered. Then Daniel forwarded one last document from the association's production. Caroline's maintenance authorization from 18 months earlier, this time with its attached accounting memorandum. The memorandum did more than name the Mercer Courtesy Access License. It stated that the annual payment was required to preserve Briar Glen's revocable permission to use the private trail. Caroline had known the access could be revoked before she ever tried to regulate my horse. The accounting memorandum changed what I thought Caroline had been doing. Until then, I could still tell myself she had inherited a messy arrangement and pushed too hard trying to protect the neighborhood. But 18 months earlier, she had approved a payment specifically described as necessary to preserve Briar Glen's revocable permission. She knew the trail was not guaranteed. She also knew the Mercer family retained control. Daniel pointed to the consequence I had missed. This helps with more than ownership, he said. Their own records show they continued using the property because permission continued. That matters if they later claim their use existed independently of the license. Suddenly, Caroline's strategy made sense. She had not mistaken my land for HOA property. She had discovered how fragile Briar Glen's access really was and tried to replace that vulnerability with permanent regulatory authority. I could have used the memorandum to embarrass her at the next board meeting. Instead, I changed strategy. Daniel drafted one final offer. Briar Glen could keep pedestrian access under a new limited license with defined maintenance responsibilities and clear liability terms. My ownership would be expressly recognized. My agricultural and equestrian use would remain unrestricted by HOA rules. Most importantly, the document would not become a perpetual easement. Caroline asked to meet alone. She looked exhausted when she arrived at my barn, but she was still composed. "If I take this to the board," she said, tapping the proposal, "I have to explain that the trail access homeowners were promised can be withdrawn." That was true before either of us sat down today. People bought houses believing otherwise. Then correcting that mistake is not the same thing as creating a new right over my property. She looked toward the northern trail where two residents were walking beneath the trees. For a moment, she seemed less like an HOA president than someone calculating how many people would feel betrayed. "I cannot recommend this," she finally said. That answer settled mine. We had already given Briar Glen the contractual opportunity to cure the interference, and I was not going to exchange my family's retained rights for a permanent easement simply to make Caroline's disclosure problem disappear. Daniel prepared the termination notice under the existing license. We specified the recreational access being terminated and made clear that nothing in the notice affected any public road, utility right, emergency access, or separately recorded right belonging to anyone else. I signed it. Caroline received it that afternoon. 20 minutes later, she called. Her voice was no longer polished. "Ethan, do you understand what happens if you close that loop?" "Yes. The board will challenge this. Then we will use the documents both of us already have." There was a long silence. "You are making this bigger than a horse fine." I looked at Copper through the open barn door. "No, Caroline. The fine showed me how big it already was." When the termination date arrived, Briar Glen's permission to use the Mercer Courtesy Loop would end, and for the first time in 20 years, the neighborhood was about to learn the difference between having access and owning it. The morning the termination took effect, I installed 2 simple farm gates at the recreational entrances from Briar Glen. Daniel had already checked the locations against my survey and the documents we had collected. I left every unrelated access point untouched. On each gate, I mounted a small sign, "Private property. Recreational access closed." By 7:30, 3 residents were standing at the northern entrance staring through the bars. One of them, a retired teacher named Susan Hale, recognized me. "Ethan, are you seriously keeping us out?" There was no anger in her voice yet, just disbelief. I offered the board continued access under a new license. "Caroline said you demanded control of the community trail." That sentence told me exactly how the dispute was being presented. I unlocked my phone and showed Susan the proposal Caroline had rejected. I did not give her a speech. I let her read the paragraph, "Preserving pedestrian access." Her expression changed. The board saw this. Caroline did. By afternoon, photographs of the closed gates were circulating through Briar Glen. Caroline called an emergency board meeting. I attended with Daniel, carrying one organized binder. My deed, my father's Mercer Courtesy Loop map, the historical access license, maintenance records, Caroline's authorization, the accounting memorandum describing revocable permission, the $500 horse assessment, our cure notice, the proposed perpetual easement, and my final limited license offer. Caroline arrived prepared too. She did not deny my ownership anymore. Instead, she argued that 20 years of continuous neighborhood reliance had created interests that could survive termination of the original license. This is not about whether Ethan owns the dirt, she told the board. It is about whether hundreds of homeowners can lose established access overnight. It was her strongest argument because it shifted attention from what the HOA had done to what ordinary residents might lose. Then Susan stood from the back row. Did Ethan offer to keep the trail open? Caroline hesitated. Under terms the association could not responsibly accept. Were we shown those terms? A board member beside Caroline lowered his eyes toward the table. The room changed. Not because everyone suddenly supported me, but because they realized there was information they had not received. Caroline recovered quickly. She announced that Briar Glen would proceed with the declaratory action she had already warned me about, and asked the court to determine whether its long-standing access rights survived my termination. Daniel leaned toward me and whispered, "Now everything depends on how the court characterizes those 20 years." Outside, Caroline caught up with me beside my truck. "You could reopen the gates tonight, and you could accept the license you rejected." Neither of us moved. She finally said, "Then we let the record decide." I looked back at the binder under Daniel's arm. For 20 years, Briar Glen had treated my father's permission as something permanent enough to advertise, but temporary enough to keep paying for, and now both sides were about to ask a judge what that contradiction actually meant. The dispute reached court with both sides arguing from the same 20 years of history. Caroline no longer claimed Briar Glen owned my land, or that my acreage belonged under its covenants. Her argument was narrower and smarter. Residents had continuously used the Mercer Courtesy Loop. The association had maintained it. Homeowners had relied on that access, and I had personally offered to continue it. She wanted those facts treated as evidence that Briar Glen's interest had grown beyond something I could simply terminate. Daniel did not attack the neighborhood's reliance. He attacked the source of it. He walked through the historical license, then the annual maintenance payments that followed it. Linda Carver confirmed why those payments had been made during her years as treasurer. My father wanted Briar Glen's records to keep recognizing that residents crossed by permission. Caroline's own maintenance authorization came next. Then the attached memorandum appeared, describing the annual payment as necessary to preserve revocable permission. Caroline stayed composed. When asked why she later supported pedestrian-only restrictions, she explained that she believed the board had an obligation to manage safety on a route residents had depended upon for years. I could understand the reasoning without accepting the authority behind it. Daniel then placed the $500 horse assessment beside Caroline's proposed perpetual easement. One document punished me for exercising a retained use. The other offered to erase that punishment if I granted Briar Glen permanent access and regulatory authority. Caroline pushed back with my own words from our private meeting. I had wanted residents to keep using the trail. Daniel agreed immediately. That surprised her. He introduced my final limited license proposal, the one preserving pedestrian access while protecting my ownership and equestrian use. My willingness to keep the trail available did not prove Briar Glen already possessed permanent rights. It showed closure had never been my first objective. Then the argument turned to the evidence Caroline believed helped her most: 2 decades of HOA maintenance. Daniel traced those payments year by year back to the license. The stronger Briar Glen made its history of involvement look, the more consistently that same history documented permission rather than ownership. Even the old cedar post fit the pattern. Permission was not a slogan my father invented after a dispute. It was how he had structured the relationship from the beginning. By the time the hearing ended, there was nothing left to discover and no surprise document waiting in another folder. The judge had the license, the payments, the HOA records, the assessment, the cure notice, the termination, and both proposed agreements. Caroline walked past me outside without speaking. Daniel closed the binder and said the next decision would answer 2 questions at once: whether Briar Glen could keep crossing my land after its permission ended, and whether an HOA could punish me for riding copper on property its own records repeatedly identified as mine. The record was closed. All that remained was the ruling. The ruling arrived 11 days later. Daniel called before I opened the electronic copy. "Ethan, read it yourself." The court recognized my 26 acres as private Mercer property outside Briar Glen's covenant authority. The historical documents showed that neighborhood use of the Mercer courtesy loop existed through permission, not ownership, and the association's repeated maintenance payments supported that relationship instead of transforming it into permanent control. My termination therefore stood under the terms of the license. Just as important, Briar Glen had no authority to assess me $500 for riding copper on land the association did not govern. The violation was withdrawn permanently. The recreational gates stayed closed. Briar Glen retained no right to cross those entrances unless I granted new permission, while every unrelated public, utility, emergency, or separately recorded access right remained untouched. Caroline did not face some ridiculous criminal punishment. The consequences were simpler and more believable. Briar Glen paid its own legal expenses, corrected the trail description in its homeowner materials, and notified residents that the Mercer courtesy loop was private property rather than an HOA-controlled amenity. At the next association election, Caroline lost the presidency. I heard about it from Susan Hale, who also told me something that mattered more. Several residents finally understood that I had offered to preserve pedestrian access before the gates ever closed. A few weeks later, the board returned to Daniel with the limited license proposal Caroline had rejected. This time the language was clear. Residents could walk a defined portion of the Mercer courtesy loop. Briar Glen would contribute to maintenance and meet the agreed insurance requirements. My ownership remained explicit. The permission remained limited. Most importantly, nothing gave the HOA authority over my lawful agricultural or equestrian use. Before I signed that new agreement, I gave myself one morning with the property exactly as the ruling had left it. I saddled Copper and rode toward the northern loop, the same ground where Caroline had once told me horses were prohibited past beneath his hooves. The pedestrian-only markers were gone. At the cedar post, I stopped and climbed down. Dirt still filled some of the old, burned lettering, so I brushed it away with my glove until my father's word was visible from end to end. Permission. Then I mounted Copper and finished the loop while both HOA recreational gates remained closed. The $500 notice that started everything was gone. My right to ride my own land was restored, and Briar Glen could no longer pretend my family's generosity belonged to them. They tried to tell me where I could ride on my property. In the end, they had to ask me whether they could enter it.